The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our live webinar today, which we have titled Challenges in Testing for Pathogens in Spices and Seasoning Blends. I am Scott Mishakian with Eurofins Marketing, moderating today's session. Joining me as our featured presenter is the Associate Scientific Director for Eurofins Microbiology, Dr. Dan Demarco. In a minute, I'll hand this over to Dan, but first I wanted to relay a few general notes on the webinar structure. So the webinar is being recorded. Slides from the presentation, as well as the recording, will be emailed out to everyone registered within 3 business days. We'll also post the webinar online for on-demand viewing. So during the webinar, you can submit questions anytime you want. You can do so using the sidebar menu. Just select the Questions tab, type in your question, then hit the Enter key on your keyboard. And remember, you can submit questions throughout the webinar, and after the presentation, we'll have a short Q&A session to answer any questions raised. Okay, that's it for me. Dan, I'll let you begin.
All right, Scott. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, everybody. Good morning. Thanks so much for joining me today. So those of you who know me, who've maybe seen some of my presentation in the past, know that I usually like to start these things out maybe a little bit more of a lighthearted, sort of fun note, mostly to relax the audience, but really mostly to relax myself. And so as I was sort of doing research for this particular topic on the internet, I came across a really interesting article that I thought would be sort of appropriate to share. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to read. I'm going to show the article, and I'm just going to read the text to you. So it's titled, McCormick & Company CEO complains his curry too spicy. Head of global spice giant can't handle the heat his own products provide. In an ironic twist, the head of global spice giant McCormick & Company, Lawrence E. Curtius, complained to waiter Naveen Reddy at local Indian restaurant Taj Palace on Thursday that his curry was, quote, too spicy. The Hunt Valley, Maryland headquartered McCormick is the largest producer of spice and related food products worldwide based on revenue. The leader of the giant Fortune 500 company said the following in a prepared statement at the conclusion of his dinner. Look, I love spicy food as much as the next guy. You could say I love spicy foods much more than the next guy. In fact, as the president and CEO of McCormick & Company, the biggest spice producer on the planet, you could say nobody in the world loves spicy foods as much as I do. But even for me, the curry was just too damn spicy. I mean, I could barely eat it. Reached for comment, Chef Narendra Madi defended his seasoning level, saying in reply, the curry was appropriately spiced. Mr. Curtius was given the choice of hot or Indian hot. He went with Indian hot. You get what you pay for. So anybody, I'm guessing there's probably a few folks from McCormick on the line. I'm just guessing. If you are, please extend my thanks to Mr. Curtius for being a good sport about this, or better yet, maybe just don't share this with him. Obviously, this is not a real article. This is a spoof article that I actually wrote particularly for this presentation. So in any event, moving into the more serious stuff, the agenda for today, I do have one slide just sort of about Eurofins. Then I'm going to give a little bit of history, just very little about spices and pathogens and sort of a modern day reality check before we move into the heart of the presentation, which is basically 2 parts, maybe 3 parts. I'm going to talk about the microbiology of spices. So talk about the fact that they're low moisture foods and the sort of the pathogens of concern in spices and low moisture foods. Talk about the prevalence of pathogens and indicators and modern disease outbreaks, and then the problem of low level contamination of spices a little bit. And then really what I think is the bulk of the talk is around the challenges, of course, the title of the presentation, with recovery and detection of pathogens in spices. And antimicrobials is the first section. I'll talk about the impact of antimicrobials on the various detection methods that we use, and then how we sort of work around these and the consequences of those workarounds. And then I'll move into PCR assay inhibitors. I'll talk about what they are, where they're found. I'll give one example case of some internal work that was done, and then talk about the options that we have for overcoming inhibition when we find it. And I'm going to talk a good bit about how we see the impact of inhibitors, actually how we in the lab actually know that that a particular sample, given sample, is actually inhibitory. And then I'm going to talk about some other difficulties that we have when we work with spices in the lab. And then I'll conclude with some take-home messages. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So the one Eurofins slide, so it's interesting, they did not make me put this slide in. Eurofins, to their credit, their great credit, does not force us to include any sort of a Eurofins promo material, but I really do love the company. I love working there. I love the people. So I'm happy to share it, happy to promo for the company. It's interesting, I presented this slide, I think about a year ago, and I had to update it for this talk, and I had to change this number of employees from 50,000 K to 61,000. I think the number of laboratories went from 800 plus to 900 plus, and I think the number of countries increased by a few as well, as do the number of tests and methods. So obviously, Eurofins is a company that's growing. And of course, we're doing it through acquisitions, but also through R&D, innovations in R&D, and that's what I do, and that's part of the group that I'm in. So if we look at spices and pathogens, and we look at the history, there's sort of a good side and there's a bad side. So the good side, of course, the Silk Road, the spice trade, you couldn't talk about the development of mankind on the planet without the spice trade and the Silk Road, and that was driven by the trade in spices. You look as far back as ancient Egypt, cinnamon was used for so many different things. Preserving meat, it was used as an antimicrobial, an antidiarrheal, and an antifungal. And if you look at across the spectrum, various herbs and spices that are out there, many of them have either a strong, medium, or at least a strong or medium antimicrobial effect. And I've listed some of those various spices here. But of course, there's also the bad side. So the plague of Athens, as far back 430 BC in Athens, Greece, was a large disease outbreak. This was described through Thucydides, and it was suggested to have been linked to the trade in spices. So saffron and pepper from the Far East. And this was actually, Salmonella typhi was recently actually identified in victims of this plague, and it was an ancestral strain to today's Salmonella typhi strain, and it was thought to be more pathogenic, and it killed close to over a quarter of the population of Athens in just over 5 years. And then the death of the Aztecs, again, Salmonella paratyphi C, 2 plagues responsible for decimating the Aztecs, up to 18 million people killed in a very short time frame. And this was likely associated with foods brought by the Spanish. And this included many spices that had never been seen in Mexico before, like garlic, coriander, and cinnamon. And then finally, before I move into the sort of the heart of the talk, just a reality check and sort of the modern perspective on this, there is of course a known risk of pathogens in spices, but the total number of outbreaks associated with spices in the last 30 years is low, very low. And the reason for this is there's several reasons, but they have a low water activity. So this prevents the growth and viability of most of your non-spore formers, and this really limits the chance of illness. They're primarily used as ingredients, lower concentrations, and there's been extensive use of pathogen reduction treatments or sterilization treatments for at least by the major producers, either radiation or ethylene oxide or steam or others. And of course, I would argue that extensive pathogen and indicator testing of products and processing and production environments by labs like the one I work for, I think has helped contribute to this as well. So spices are, of course, low moisture foods, and we define those as foods with low water activity. And you see different descriptions or definitions of that. I think more appropriately a water activity of less than 0.6. Intermediate, they say, is 0.6 to 0.85. And just as a reminder for you all that most bacterial growth, the cutoff is approximately 0.85. And this includes ready-to-eat foods and ingredients. And its important point is it does not prevent the survival of most of the common pathogens. It just really stops their growth, inhibits their growth. There are low moisture foods have been implicated in a large number of foodborne outbreaks and recalls, and I'll talk about a few of those, or at least show a few of those. Per FDA, interesting thing about spices, per FDA, they're considered category 1 or 2 foods, which typically do not undergo any sort of lethal inactivation step. That's part of the definition of a category 1 or 2 food prior to human consumption. And what this does is it triggers specific, very stringent testing requirements. But if you look at almost all spices on grocery store shelves today, at least again from the major producers, they are treated with some sort of a pathogen inactivation, a treatment or step. So what are the pathogens that we're worried about in spices? Well, of course, salmonella. This is the big one. This is the one that we're mostly worried about. It's the most common by far associated with product recalls and outbreaks. Has a very low infectious dose, as I'll talk a little bit about, and it is stable, very stable in dry environments and quite hardy. E. coli, you also hear about, but it's been much less commonly associated with outbreaks and recalls. One big exception, Europe in 2011, with the O104H4, was a fenugreek associated with fenugreek seeds. And you can find O157H7 in fresh herbs as well. You have Bacillus cereus and Clostridium perfringens. These are spore formers. Of course, as spore formers, they're resistant to environmental stressors, and they can also survive cooking processes. So Clostridium perfringens has been isolated from a range of spices and herbs, but their counts have typically been on sort of the lower side. And they're generally felt to be a low health concern because of the relatively high infectious dose and mild symptoms. Though as someone who has fairly recently had perfringens, I would argue with the mild symptoms part of that. Botulinum and others are also out there. So there has been botulinum associated with dried spices, but the outbreaks have been very rare. And there was one in 1989 with garlic and oil, and 2007, a hot dog chili sauce. And the reason why I think is that at low water activity like this, germination is prevented. And that's probably exactly why outbreaks are so rare. You can also find Listeria mono and very rarely parasites like Cyclospora in fresh herbs. So if we look at the prevalence of pathogens and indicators in spices, and this is all data from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, different studies or reports. In 2017, they went out and looked at 125 gram samples from retail establishments and found a prevalence of 0 to 0.64% positive for salmonella, and that data is shown there in table 1. They also looked at 50 gram lots of spices that were treated with various pathogen reduction treatments, and they found generic E. coli at a rate of 0 to 3.48%. Now, generic E. coli, not a pathogen, of course, but an indicator, and also saying perhaps that the sterilization, so-called sterilization treatments aren't exactly sterilizing. 2007 and 2009, they saw imported spices with a 6.6% contamination rate, and that's been really consistent over the past 30 years. And they do say that the dried spices are almost 2 times more likely to be contaminated with salmonella than any other FDA-regulated food import. Here's one more study. This one was sponsored by the American Spice Trade Association from the University of Wisconsin. I'm showing the data here in Table 3, basically just looking at total plate counts, different types of plate counts of various spice samples from around the world. First important point about this data is that there was no salmonella or E. coli detected, generic E. coli. And I did highlight here that some of these spices that are considered to be medium are strongly antimicrobial. That does not mean that they are free of microorganisms, of course, because these antimicrobials are specific in their activity, and so other microorganisms are not at all susceptible to them. So they do still have relatively high counts, total plate counts. If you look at spice-associated outbreaks and recalls, this is a combination of 2 different data sources, one from American Spice Trade Association and another paper that I pulled, or FDA, from 1974 to 2017. This is a comprehensive list of the various spice-associated outbreaks. And there really aren't that many given the time frame, and the number of cases is actually fairly on the low side. If you look at spice recalls from 1970 to 2003, 21 recalls with 12 different contaminated spice types, and all but 1 were salmonella. Paprika was the most often involved culprit. And late breaking, as of this morning, I just was informed there is an active cumin recall for salmonella. No illness is reported as yet. I don't have any other details. I did put the link here, and I'm sure if you do a quick Google search, you can find out more than you'll ever want to know about what's going on with this late breaking cumin recall. So how do spices become contaminated? Well, this is one way. So many spices come from parts of the world where hygiene, sanitation practices aren't necessarily at the same standards that they are in the West. And here obviously you can see, I believe these are peppers in an open air market. People walking walking on them with their feet. Obviously no gloves, no booties. And this is the kind of thing I think you see, in different parts of the world where spices basically do come from. And so one of the issues not only is the frequency of contamination a concern, but the fact that you can have this low-level contamination, and we know that the foodborne pathogens, like staph and like salmonella, do have very low infectious doses. Now I remember way back when I was in graduate school many years ago. Maybe this is dating myself, but we were taught that the infectious dose for salmonella was around 10 to the 3rd CFU per mil. Okay, we know that that's absolutely not the case. Certainly now, I mean, it's much lower than that. There have been chocolate-associated outbreaks, 1 to 6 CFU per gram, cause illness. So an infectious dose of right around 50 cells. Another chocolate outbreak with an estimated infectious dose of 10 cells, and they found, of course, the chocolate bars that had 10 CFU per 100 grams. And this paprika potato chip associated outbreak, 0.45 CFU per gram. So very low levels can cause disease. And the issue with low levels of foodborne pathogens, there's a few. One, they can serve as inocula into higher moisture foods. You think about seasonings that are added to ready-to-eat foods. And of course, it makes it difficult for us as the testing labs to identify contaminated products because they're often there below the detection limit of many methods. We use enrichment, of course, to overcome antimicrobials, but to overcome this issue. But the antimicrobials in the spices can complicate that approach. And then you have these rapid method inhibitors, PCR inhibitors, that make this even harder. I'm going to talk a lot about that. A little more detail on antimicrobials. So as I mentioned, detecting and isolating bacteria from spices is challenging because of these antimicrobials, and they are highly variable in their quantity and their type. I've listed some here. You have essential oils and phenolics, which are kind of the 2 most potent, but you have others. The polyphenolics are also well known as potent PCR inhibitors. I've also shown a number of the different specific antimicrobials in various spices are listed there. They don't always repress microbial growth. Okay, so salmonella, we know, can actually grow in black pepper. And this is an important point. They may be non-homogeneously distributed throughout a food sample. You think about a seasoning blend or really any food matrix, this is a potential issue. And they sometimes, and I would say oftentimes, necessitate a use of a higher dilution with the various detection methods that we use. And that includes both conventional and rapid methods. And the challenge here is to dilute enough to reduce the toxicity so that you don't have that antimicrobial activity without undermining the validity of your sampling plan, or reducing the limit of detection of your method to greater than 1 CFU per sample, which is sort of the requirement. Here's one example case where we had, this came from the literature, where we had someone testing product. They were testing 30 75-gram samples, and they were seeing a 50% salmonella positive rate. They made the decision to switch to 30 25-gram samples, so it's a 66% reduction in what there is, sampling volume, and their positive rate dropped in half, from 50 to 25%. And that's the sort of thing that can happen when you start testing smaller samples or doing dilutions. If you look more specifically at enrichments, FDA recommends that for most spices, we do a 1 to 10 in TSB, and this includes a recommended 60-minute soak time. The idea there is, I think, resuscitation of injured cells, and also perhaps for pH stabilization. For dried garlic flakes, onion flakes, and powder also, they recommend the addition of 0.5% K2SO3. You have other spices like allspice, cinnamon, cloves, oregano, where there's just no way to neutralize, at least no known way to neutralize those antimicrobial properties. So what they do, dilution. We dilute cloves 1 to 1,000, oregano, cinnamon, and allspice 1 to 100. The upshot of that is that we have to test much smaller, sample sizes, because you can't test a 375-gram sample with a 1 to 1,000 dilution. There's no laboratory that could do that. It's just the size of that enrichment would be too big to handle. So we test much smaller samples. And of course, longer enrichment times may also be required when you start diluting. BAM, and if you look at a lot of our internal data, suggests that 22 hours is really the minimum acceptable for at least some of the spices. And if you look at through the literature, I did a lot of this, there are all kinds of things you'll see about the different levels of dilution that are needed or required for the recovery of salmonella. This is just one example. This was with sublethally injured salmonella, Grabham et al. They saw a 1 to 100 for basil, ginger, garlic, peppermint, oregano, clover, and mustard. And then they needed a 1 to 1,000 for oregano and cinnamon. And then for 26 other herbs and spices they tested, they only needed a 1 to 20. And we have some internal validation data showing that a 1 to 100 in TSB with BHI regrow is needed for oregano. And I'll talk more about that later. And that we need a 1 to 10 TSB with K2SO3 for garlic powder. Again, these are both when paired with real-time PCR as the endpoint detection. So PCR inhibitors, the other issue in addition to antimicrobials. So like any other chemical reaction, PCR is a chemical reaction that can be inhibited. And this is a very, very important point. Major take-home message here. Inhibition is concentration dependent. And because foods almost always are non-homogeneous substances, inhibitors in food, just like with antimicrobials, can also be non-homogeneously distributed. So what that means is that in a given food enrichment, a given food sample, the inhibitory properties might not be the same when subsamples are pipetted for testing, either or for plating or for testing by PCR or other rapid methods or whatever. Every time you go in and pipette that sample, it could be slightly different in terms of the concentration of inhibitory substance that you actually pipette out. Okay, there's 4 main mechanisms really for inhibition of PCR. Either you degrade the DNA, the target DNA, or the primers and probes. Degradation or binding or inactivation of the polymerase, the tag polymerase. There's or binding, sequestration, or competition with magnesium chloride, which is a needed cofactor for TAC. Or there's some impact on the chemistry of the buffer system. So either the pH or the buffering capacity is impacted in some way. And there are a ton of known PCR inhibitors, some of which, many of which actually are found in spices. There's also still, this is an important point, some that are unknown or not well characterized. In fact, I would argue there are probably many that are unknown and not well characterized. But they tend to fall into these various classes. They're either nucleases or proteinases. They're calcium or iron or other ions. They're polyphenolics and hemes. They're complex polysaccharides and fats. Rarely, I don't actually think I've seen this in my entire career where high background flora has actually caused an inhibition of PCR, though I understand it can be, at least for some PCRs, it can be a problem. Arguably, you could say that there are highly colored or light reflective matrices, specifically for fluorescent or luminescent-based detection systems could be considered inhibitory, but it's not really inhibition, it's really the detection step. The detection of the amplified products is what's interfered with in that case. So here's an example sort of inhibition in action. This is a validation study that we did for oregano with salmonella with and without a VHI regrow step. So a VHI regrow step is you have a primary enrichment, and then before you actually take it into your rapid method, you sub that into a small volume of VHI and let that grow back up. So it's a dilution and a regrow. The idea is you regrow the cells back up to the level they would have been at if you had tested directly from that enrichment. Okay, so typically it's about 3 hours for that regrow step. This was 37.5 gram samples. This was an AOEC Appendix J style study with 20 fractional spikes and 5 high and 5 uninoculated. Salmonella typhimurium was the inoculum. We enriched 1 to 100 in pre-warm TSB at 37 for 22 hours, and then we tested by batching real-time salmonella PCR, either directly or following that regrow. And then we culture confirmed all samples as well. by FDA BAM. And we use both cultural biochemical and PCR colony confirmation. And if you look at the data here, and I'm showing the data here, it's a really nice study. The data, it all sort of matched up, at least if you look at the with BHI regrow column. But you can see when there was not a BHI regrow, we actually had 2 indeterminate results. Now, it turned out those indeterminate results were actually true negatives, but that didn't necessarily have to be the case. It could have been just as easily been one of the positive samples that potentially was inhibited. And that's kind of interesting, but what's more interesting is when you actually look at more depth at the data and you look at the actual CQ values. And here you can really see the difference. If you look at without BHI regrow, you had higher average CQ values of about 3.6. As a reminder, 3.3 CQs is about a log, so 1 log of growth. So a 1 log difference in sensitivity is a substantial difference in sensitivity, and that was seen at both inoculum levels. We also saw a shift in the internal positive control result of about a log as well. Now, I'll talk more about what that means and how we use IPC actually in a bit. And again, we saw those indeterminate results on those 2 samples. And as I mentioned, those 2 indeterminates were true negatives, but they didn't have to be, and they were only seen without the BHI regrow. So you really did need, I think this data is a clear indication that without that additional 1 to 50 dilution that the regrow protocol provided, testing oregano with just a single enrichment would not actually work with this particular method, or you'd be taking a risk at least of having indeterminate results, and maybe potentially, in worst case, a false negative. So you think about all those different inhibitors and the types of the classes of inhibitors, and there's a lot of them, and they're everywhere, and they're in almost every food, and they're in fact almost everywhere. So why don't we actually see more PCR inhibition? Why does PCR actually work in food testing? And I'm going to show you exactly why. I'm going to give you the answer to that question right here by showing you a commonly used real-time PCR-based method for salmonella detection. With this method, you have an enrichment. You transfer 5 microliters of that into a lysis buffer, a small volume of lysis buffer, and I'm showing the actual math down here. So that's 5 microliters into 200 microliters is 0.0243 microliters of that original enrichment. From that, you take 30 microliters to hydrate a lyophilized master mix. Okay, so you're only taking 0.73 microliters of that enrichment into that final PCR reaction. So if you do the math on that, for a 25-gram sample, that's only 0.0003% of the entire volume that you're actually sampling. And for a 375-gram sample, it's even a smaller volume of the entire, smaller amount of that sample that you're taking into the final reaction. So if you ever wondered why we need to enrich for so long, this is the answer. That's why you have to enrich for so long. You're taking such a small portion of that original sample into the final detection step. It's also why PCR inhibition is not really an issue, or not more of an issue in food testing. Again, because we're taking such a small portion of that original sample, which is already diluted, into the final reaction. And if you look at methods, PCR methods that are used widely in food testing, they're all a little bit different in this respect. So they all bring sort of a slightly different amount of sample into that final reaction. And again, if you remember what I said earlier, inhibition is concentration dependent. Okay, because of that, the more volume you bring into the reaction equates to a higher probability of inhibition of that reaction. Now, of course, that's with all other things being equal, which they absolutely are not. We know for a fact, we have data in fact which shows that they are not all equal. So even though it looks nice on paper, you can say the higher volume means a higher probability of inhibition. That's not always necessarily the case, but in a general sense, it is true that the more volume you bring in gives you a higher probability of inhibition. So how do we overcome PCR inhibition in foods? Well, I already talked about this, I think, which is dilution. By far, this is the most common. It's used for just about everything. And you can do this in several ways. You can dilute the primary enrichment more. So that sample to media ratio, the 1 to 10, the 1 to 20, 1 to 100, or 1 to 1,000. You have the use of a secondary enrichment or a regrow step, like that BHI regrow step I just showed with the oregano study. Or you can transfer less volume into the sample prep. The previous slide I just showed you, that those methods, you could change those methods around so that you bring less volume into the final. There's all kinds of other ways that you can do this. Okay, there's physical and chemical separation methods. There's filtration, dielectrophoresis, sonication, centrifugation, different centrifugation methods, combinations of centrifugation methods, adsorption, all kinds of affinity ligand separation approaches with magnetic particles, including IMS and phage binding proteins and others. You can use evaporation. Lots of different ways you can go about this. All of them, though, require that your food matrix at least partially be in a liquid format or a liquid phase. And they also can have the opposite of the intended effect, which is actually can end up concentrating inhibitors. In particular, things like evaporation can have that problem. And they can also be useful, as many of them can be useful as concentration steps, or they can be combined with concentration technologies like IMS to give you better sensitivity. But overall, and we see this again and again in food testing, that these methods are almost never used or rarely used because they're just not efficient enough, and the lack of the efficiency, sorry, or the ease of use, or the time that it takes. Cancels out, pardon me, let me get a sip of water there, or a sip of Mountain Dew, cancels out any of the concentration gains that you might get. In addition to those things, you can also look at the PCR side, the lysis side of the equation, and you can do things with the lysis buffer, because the lysis efficiency, in addition to PCR, can also be inhibited or impacted by different inhibitors. The upshot of that is sort of reduced PCR sensitivity on the back end. So you can look at different lysis buffers, or you can look at different treatments. I mean, there's thermal, there's mechanical, there's enzymatic, there's lots of different ways you can go about breaking open cells. You can look at different Taq polymerases. There's some that are more robust to certain inhibitors than others. You can also look at different chemistries. There are more PCR chemistries on the market than you could ever imagine. I've listed just a few here, but some of them might be more robust to particular inhibitors than others. And of course, if you're smart, if you're a test kit developer, as I once was, you can do PCR reaction optimization. Okay, you can look at inhibitors, and you can say, if we increase or decrease the concentration of various reagents in the PCR, what impact does that actually have on inhibition and the ability to withstand inhibitors, the presence of inhibitors, and all kinds of handles and knobs you can play with that you can tweak to make that better or more robust. So the question you might be asking, if you aren't asleep right now, is how do we actually see PCR inhibition? Okay, so and I'm going to show you how. I'm going to show you how we see it. I'm going to show you one way that we actually see this. So most PCR methods, at least in the food space, contain primers and or probes if they're real-time methods, specific for at least two targets. So there's what's called an internal positive control, or an IPC, and then the actual target, the pathogen target. The IPC, basically the amplification of that internal positive control, tells you that the conditions were met for successful detection of target, if it had been there. Okay, so if target were there, IPC will amplify. Had it been there, IPC tells you that it would have been detected. When inhibitors are present, both of those reactions are inhibited. Okay, you need a well-optimized PCR, and not all PCRs are well-optimized, but well-optimized PCR reactions are designed so that the amplification of this internal positive control is impacted first. Okay, it's got to be shut down prior to shutdown of target amplification. In other words, that IPC target has to be more sensitive to inhibition than the target. And why is that? If you think it through in your head, maybe you can come to this conclusion, because if you don't, in the presence of IPC, in the presence of inhibition, IPC would amplify, okay, which again tells you that the reaction worked, but if target were present, it may not, and that might give you a false negative result. And then you'd have no indication to question it. You look at the result, you say, looks good, IPC was not inhibited, or IPC maybe was just a little bit inhibited, but no problem here, reaction worked fine. But in reality, you had perhaps a low level of target there that was inhibited just a bit, and you missed it because of that. So it's a really, as a test kit developer, as a PCR or a rapid method developer, it's a difficult balancing act, because if that reaction is too strong, you can get the potential of false negatives I just mentioned. But if you make it too weak, what you have is a too high a number of reactions that shut down, and you get these really annoying, indeterminate, or questionable results that everybody hates to see. So it's a difficult challenge. And I'm going to show you, this is an example of what it actually looks like on the actual instrument, some of the instruments that we use. This is an endpoint PCR. Real-time PCR is very similar. It's not quite as interesting to look at, so I chose to show you an endpoint PCR example with null curves. What I'm showing you here is what a negative control looks like. So this is an uninoculated sample. So this would just be media. There's no salmonella present. There's no competitive flora. There's no food matrix. And this is a clean negative result. And that peak you're looking at there, that big curvy thing, is in what's called the IPC peak. If target had been present, it would be to the right of that, in that area where it says, you can see it says salmonella there. Maybe perhaps that's where the peaks, if salmonella were present, you would see, but it's not, because this is a negative sample. In a non-inhibitory sample, a real sample now, this is a food matrix sample with food matrix. This is 94 samples, actual real samples, production samples with food matrix. You should see that the peak characteristics look the same, look very similar to that negative control, right? They should be just like if there were just media there. There should be no impact on that internal positive control. But there's no inhibition. You should get negative results. Now, if inhibitory substances are present, this is what you see. Is one of the things that you see. You get these distortions in that internal control peak. Okay, it gets flattened, or it gets the curve shape widens, or the shifts in temperature. All these sort of strange things happen. The algorithms that make the results calls for these instruments are set up to detect that and to flag those and call those as indeterminate or questionable results. So I put this table together, comparing antimicrobials and inhibitors, and I like it. It compares against a number of different sort of categories, and the ones that are in green in this table are areas where they're basically the same, and where I think they're the same. And the ones that are in white that are not highlighted in green, I think are actually different. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this table. So if you think about the diversity of antimicrobials and inhibitors, again in spices specifically, it's high, and you might have more than one present, and it's going to be variable. And that's true for antimicrobials and inhibitors. They both are going to be non-homogeneously distributed, or could be non-homogeneously distributed in the matrix and in the enrichment. Now, I say that with a lack of knowing there's a lack of data really on the distribution, at least that I'm aware of on the distribution of antimicrobials or inhibitors in a food matrix or enrichment. However, I have internal data, and I know from personal experience that you can pipette out of the same sample multiple times and get different results in terms of the inhibitory effect of that particular sample. And again, you think about food as a non-homogeneous substance. You think about inhibitors, antimicrobials as having different chemical properties. They're going to associate specifically with different phases, the solid phase, the liquid phase. And again, as particulates are, not homogeneously distributed, you might get more in one pipetting event than another. They are going to be non-homogeneously distributed. And again, I think they're, in both cases, they're not all discovered. They're not all well characterized. So there's still some probably out there, at least on the inhibitor side for sure, to be discovered. And in terms of how they work, I mean, they can work alone, of course, but they also can have synergistic effects, both of these, both antimicrobials and inhibitors. And they can also have antagonistic effects. So they might work against each other, and they can have those effects with each other or with other compounds that are present in the food matrix. Again, food being such a complex substance. And they're both, again, very, very important. They both act in a concentration-dependent manner. If you look at the effects that they have on, this is where they start to differ a little bit on different areas. So in terms of the rapid method results, so that's sort of the PCR or other rapid method test, what the effect would be. Well, for an antimicrobial, you could get a false negative. And the reason why would be because the pathogen didn't grow to detectable levels. Okay. For inhibitors, you could also get a false negative, or you could get an indeterminate result, but this would be because of a direct impact on the detection assay chemistry, at least in the case of the indeterminate result, and maybe even in the case of a false negative. In terms of the cultural confirmation results, so in food testing, we take all presumptive positives to confirmation, or most. And then for an antimicrobial, you could end up with a not detected result because the organisms, say, didn't grow to a high enough level in that primary enrichment, or they failed to grow on culture plates. For inhibitors, there really would be no effect here on the culture confirmation result. And on the final result, what everybody cares about, the potential effect. For antimicrobials, potentially a false negative or a non-confirming presumptive, very, very rarely. And for an inhibitor, an indeterminate or questionable result or a false negative. Now, in practice, and this is maybe the disturbing thing perhaps, a false negative would not be noticed because negative samples are not taken to confirmation in food testing and production environments. And there's good reasons for that. And really, the risk is low as long as the laboratory that you're using is doing the right thing and validating and verifying the matrices that they're testing in advance. So they know which matrices are inhibitory and they do the right things in terms of the sample prep up front to make sure they don't have this issue of false negatives that are missed. And how do you observe the effect? Again, here's what I just said, and I spilled the beans here. Validation and verification studies in advance of production testing. Absolute must-have for spice testing for sure. Low moisture foods in general, but for sure for spices, you've got to do this, and most foods really. And in terms of inhibitors, you also got to do you also want to make sure, of course, you got to do these studies, but you want to look at methods that have an internal positive control or have sort of an assay positive control for other rapid methods. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the conclusions. But in terms of how we remediate or prevent, very similar, and again, the most commonly used, again, another take-home message, dilution. Dilution, it's a solution to pollution. It's also a solution to inhibition and antimicrobial activity as well. There are, of course, physical and chemical sample prep methods that are possible, but they're really not used for antimicrobials. And they're not really used for inhibitors either, even though there are many, many methods that have been developed and shown to work fairly well. And again, it's because of the impact on ease of use typically. All right, there are other issues. It's not just antimicrobials, unfortunately, antimicrobials and inhibitors that make testing spices and seasoning blends difficult. You also have the problem of stressed or sublethally injured cells. There's all kinds of ways, again, this is in the literature of looking at recovery or the best way to recover sublethally injured cells, but there's not really a consensus for sure on the best way. You can look at non-selective pre-enrichments with a slightly lower temperature. You can do a reduced or no antibiotic containing pre-enrichment and then transfer to full strength media. You reduce nutrient level, then transfer to full strength nutrients. You have this 60-minute soak that FDA recommends, but you also have other approaches like with different media additives, sodium pyruvate catalase. I've listed a few there, and there's all kinds of plating media, overlay and underlay methods that reportedly have improved the recovery of sublethally injured cells. You also have the issue of large sample sizes. So many of these spices require 375-gram sample testing, and when you have large sample sizes, you have large enrichments, and these enrichments can take a lot of time to get to the appropriate temperature, incubation temperature. So it's critical that you do pre-warming. You sometimes have to adjust the pH as well. You can have these leafy herbs that will absorb water at a very high rate and you get this sort of viscous mass that's just not workable. You can't pipette it if you dilute just 1 to 10. You also have a confounder in particulates, because many of these dried herbs, when you actually plate them, they can resemble growth, and that can trip up laboratories that don't know what they're doing or what to look for. And some spices are hygroscopic. Okay? They can absorb moisture, which can potentially promote bacterial growth. So with that, I'm going to move into my conclusions. Again, these are sort of what I hope are the take-home messages from today. In general, can't stress it enough that spices really are very safe. Of course, they can become contaminated, but again, you look at the outbreaks over the past 30 years, they've been very, very low. And the reasons for this I mentioned, but the major producers do treat with pathogen reduction treatments prior to reaching the consumer, but even low-level contamination can be a risk. Antimicrobials and inhibitors, I said this many times, they act in a concentration-dependent fashion. They can be non-homogeneously distributed, and this is particularly relevant to spice and seasoning blend testing. Dilution, again, the primary mechanism to alleviating their effects for both the antimicrobials and also for the PCR methods and the inhibition problems. And there are all these other approaches that are possible, but they really are almost never or rarely used, at least again in the production laboratory environment like I work. Rapid method internal controls critical to diagnosing inhibition. Most PCR methods that are used for spice testing do have this. LAMP, isothermal PCR would be the one exception, but in general, LAMP has the advantage of being somewhat more robust to certain inhibitors than PCR, so it may not actually necessarily be a downside for LAMP in this case. But it does require knowledge of what to look for. Again, harping on the importance of using a knowledgeable or reputable testing lab with people like me that know, what we're looking for and have experience looking at these sorts of things and can diagnose inhibition when we see it. And then, even more importantly, most importantly, verification, validation testing in advance to determine method suitability. You really can't just take any old method and apply it to a spice. It has to be or seasoning blend. They're all uniquely, especially on the blend side, uniquely a little bit different, and it actually makes our jobs quite difficult because a given producer might have, a manufacturer may have 150, 200, 300 different seasoning blends that they want to test with a given method. How do you go about verifying all of those particular matrices? It's a difficult problem. They can't necessarily do them all, so we try to group them in a sort of a way that makes sense. And again, adjustments to standard sample preparation techniques will probably be required or might be required if you do see growth or detection method inhibition with a given matrix that you want to test. Again, that's where having an experienced lab that knows how to deal with these things is helpful and useful. So with that, so I do have some acknowledgements. I wanted to thank my esteemed Eurofins R&D colleagues, Dr. David Legan and Dr. Doug Marshall, Dr. Chris Crow, Joe Almasso, and Erica Miller. They all provided input to the talk. They also helped me edit certain things. Also, other esteemed Eurofin colleagues, Dr. Supat, Mr. Spice, Dr. Supat Saravicha, Aaron Huckabee, Troy Ayers, and my wife, who also provided some input, especially on the historical stuff. And there are some whom I lean heavily for reference materials. The American Spice Trade Association, thank you. The US FDA as well, and Joe Meyer and Gertler et al., who wrote a very nice review paper on the topic that I used a lot of the background info from. So thank you to those folks. And with that, I will take questions. But before I throw it to the audience for questions, I did receive one question from the audience in advance that I thought I would share because I thought it was one question that might be on many people's minds. And this actually came from Robert Demarco. I'm not sure if I know who this guy is, but he asked by text after I told him I was giving this talk. He said, as with most people, keep spices almost forever and wonder if they get buggy. So I don't know if my talk actually answered that question or not. Maybe it did in a sort of a roundabout way, but I'm going to give the answer here. I'm going to give my answer. I'm going to give two answers. I'm going to give my short answer, so not all that short, but I'm going to give my short, easy answer, which is that dried spices, at least, they're either safe from day one, or very, very rarely they're contaminated from day one. So unless you contaminate them yourself by exposure to yourself or something else contaminated in your kitchen, they will remain safe until you use them. The same cannot be said of the quality, which could degrade over time, depending on how it's stored, the spice in question, etc. And of course, insect infestation could also be a concern with long-term storage. The slightly longer answer is that if you're unlucky enough to purchase a contaminated spice and you don't open or use it for a very long time, it could remain unsafe for a very long time, or it could become safer over time, depending on the organism with which it is contaminated, the level that it was contaminated, the particular spice or blend, and the storage conditions. So we know there's been documented cases of salmonella causing infection up to 7 months and can survive out to at least a year in a dried state. And I've heard reports of salmonella surviving much longer than that. I don't know if it's been actually published material, but I've heard of salmonella surviving in a dried state for much longer than that. Now, chocolate, a very different environment than spices. Chocolate, I would argue, a much more favorable environment. You have fat which can protect the organism. But still, salmonella can survive a long time in a dried state. And of course, as I mentioned, even very low levels can be dangerous. And spore-forming organisms can survive almost indefinitely in dried states. So spore formers could be potentially an issue. But again, you have to be pretty darn unlucky to purchase a contaminated spice sample. So I hope I answered your question, Dad. And with that, I'll open up the floor for any other questions. And thanks, everybody, for your attention today.
All right, great. Thank you, Dan. Excellent overview on testing spices here. So we have had a few questions come in, and I'll get to those. First, I want to remind everyone, continue to send in your questions you may have. We'll get to what we can. And again, if we don't address what you have here, we'll be sure to follow up with you directly after. So I've had a couple come in, and a question of my own too. I could try and merge them a little bit. So
sure.
In general, like, what's the best platform to use for testing spices? And to kind of take that a little further really quick, one particular question was, wouldn't LAMP be a better choice for detection? And then also curious on, what's my other question here? Use an immunoassay versus PCR in place.
Yep.
Can you elaborate on that?
All great questions.
Yeah.
I can, yeah. So the answer to the best method is there is no one best method. Today, if you look at rapid methods that are available, they're all very, very similar in performance characteristics. They all have similar validations. They've all been tested in a similar way. Some have been around longer than others. Some may have more depth in validations and verifications in one area than another, but their performance is all very similar across methods. So I think if they're validated, if it's a validated method, and you're working with a reputable lab, just about any method can be used for testing spices. I would not say that there's a best method. Of course, I'm a PCR guy, so I'm gonna lean towards PCR. Immunoassays can be effective as well. There are inhibitors for immunoassays. It's a different situation there. You're talking about detection of surface proteins. You're talking about use of antibodies or other binding ligands that detect outer surface antigens. So it's a different mechanism of detection. It's not nucleic acid detection. So the things that will inhibit that or impact that reaction are different, and those methods tend to be slightly less sensitive. But again, not an issue if you're doing a long enough enrichment, and all these methods have enrichments. Okay, so I think immunoassays are also can be used and can be appropriate. LAMP, a good one, isothermal PCR. It is more robust. We know, I've seen data that shows that it's more robust to certain inhibitors than traditional PCR. So yeah, it can be a viable approach as well. I think it's one of these things where you've got to pick a method or ask your lab, your reputable testing lab, what they might recommend, and then do the work up front to demonstrate, or have the vendor, the person who's made the method, do the work to demonstrate that it works for your particular products. And because every situation is going to be just a little bit different.
Awesome. Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
All right, a little bit more general clarification question, perhaps. Can you define inhibitor
Sure.
versus antimicrobial again? And what is a good example of
Sure.
each?
Yeah, so antimicrobial would be something that directly affects the growth of the target organism. In our case, it's the growth of the pathogen. So allicin, as an example, I think it's in garlic, or cinnamonaldehyde in cinnamon. These are antimicrobials. They actually impact the growth, either killing, either biocidal or biostatic effects. They stop them from growing or actively kill them in spices. An inhibitor is defined, at least in this way, as something that inhibits the PCR reaction. So inhibits the detection event on the back end. So the organism grows appropriately. It gets to where you need to see it, but when you actually go to the detection step, you don't see it because the actual detection event is inhibited, and it's by some chemical route.
Okay, perfect. A couple questions on sort of blends and mixed ingredient testing. So
Yeah.
if you receive a seasoning with like an unknown composition, so how would you go about that? What sort of pre-enrichment protocol might you go about using?
Yeah, what we tend to do is look for the most common, a shared ingredient. Perhaps that's one of the more commonly found, or the highest concentration ingredient. Start there, and look and see what's been done for that particular ingredient, and maybe start with that enrichment. Do a verification study. If it works, great. You move on. You move on to the next one, and you keep going. If it doesn't, you go back and you say, okay, let's look at the next most most highest concentration ingredient, or let's try, and then we say, let's try this different enrichment, let's try this dilution, let's try this enrichment time, let's try this maybe different media even. So it's only when it doesn't work that you really have to get into the weeds of trying to adjust the method to accommodate. But really, it's about grouping, and it's about grouping by concentration of the most common ingredients and shared ingredients across different groups.
Okay.
But it's a tough problem, no doubt about it, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Another one here, perhaps from Home Cooks at Home. I don't think this is Dad, but if the spice is contaminated for some reasons, will cooking eliminate them? And for how long? What temperature? What might you do?
Yeah, well, I can't answer the question on the temperature because it really depends on the organism. So spore formers can survive cooking processes. So your Clostridiums of the world, Bacillus of the world, cooking may or may not do the job. And in terms of cooking temperature, I can't say again. It depends on the organism that you're talking about.
Okay.
But all that information is widely available on the internet for sure.
Of course, yeah. Okay. This question here, I think, is related to the complexity of the sample. So, due to pocketing, what is the best way to pull samples for testing?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Due to pocketing, I think it related to how challenging it is to get a homogeneous sample from mixed, and how inhibitors might be pocketed throughout.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So it's partitioning of potentially. So when you say pulling a sample for testing, that's the question: is what does that mean? Pulling it from where? From the original, in terms of compositing the original sample of material, or in terms of pulling the sample post enrichment for testing? I think in either case, the key is mixing. I mean, making sure that you're having as sufficient a mixing as you can to get the sample as homogeneously distributed or as well mixed as you can before sampling. And other than that, dilution again. If you have a problem where you just can't get a reproducible sample, it could be because you're just not pipetting up the material. So you may have to dilute more. And if you dilute more, you may have to then add enrichment time to come up to overcome that dilution effect, that loss of sensitivity.
Perfect. Okay. Here's another interesting question. How should production environments perceive indicator organisms surrounding SBC or even EB?
That's a great question. It's everybody looks at that in a sort of a different way, is how impactful those results are. I guess the question is, why are you doing indicator testing? Some people use indicator testing because they don't want a pathogen result. They're scared of a pathogen result. I think you can use indicator testing in a right way to kind of diagnose areas of risk potentially in your production environment. But you can't overestimate the results, or you can't overestimate the impact of those results or what they actually mean. I think you still have to do pathogen testing is the thing. You're not going to be able to get out of pathogen testing by doing indicator testing, no matter how much you do, in my opinion. So pathogen testing is always going to be required. I do think indicator testing is a good thing, but I think again it has to be used in the right way and not as a replacement for pathogen testing. And I think the key here too is, what do you do with the data? I mean, there's a lot of people that do indicator testing. The data goes into a notebook. The notebook goes on a shelf. Nobody ever looks at it. Okay, that doesn't help you. If you're doing indicator testing, you've got to use that data. You got to look at that data. You've got to chart that data, plot it. You got to spend time with it. Massage it and use it to do things, to make decisions, and to make adjustments as things change in your process.
Okay, perfect. Okay, next question. Perhaps review or elaborate on a topic here. So could you please go over again what preventions are put in place to reduce the risk of false negatives? Are there some things that production facilities should be concerned about when reviewing results?
I think from the customer side, I would not have that concern on the back end. I think what you need to understand is that the laboratory that you're working with on the front end is reputable and knowledgeable in this area, and that they understand, particularly in the area of spices and seasoning blends, the difficulties associated with testing these matrices. And they don't just say, okay, send me your matrix and I'll start testing. Because if they say that, that's probably not a good sign, because it's going to take. They really need to do some pre-work to understand. At least look at the formulation, look at the ingredients, ask questions about if it's been tested by someone else previously. What were the results? What happened when it was tested previously? All those sorts of questions your testing lab should be asking you when you go to them with a new product that you want to start getting tested, certainly in the spice, really any food, but in the spice and seasoning area for sure. If you don't get those kind of questions from your testing lab, then you've got to ask those questions. You got to say, why are you not asking me these questions? Because I think I need to know the answers. And you should know the answers to these questions before you start testing my products. But if you have done that work up front, then I think you really have very little to fear as far as false negatives or bad results, because that means the laboratory has done their work, the right work in advance to make sure that that won't happen.
Perfect. Okay. Okay, so jumping around a little bit, but testing a larger sample size of a spice with inherent antimicrobial compounds could increase probability of false negatives. So again, like a little bit of a clarification there.
Yeah, I mean it's possible if you dilute so much, because it doesn't really matter if it's a large sample size or a small sample size. You can dilute so much that you dilute below sort of limit of detection of a given method, and that's always a risk with dilution. So the way you can overcome that is by adding a time. You can add a time on the enrichment on the back end, is what's typically done to make sure that doesn't happen. But it requires, again, some knowledge of what, and maybe even some studies to understand, what the impact of a given dilution might be for a given organism.
Okay, we've got time for maybe one or two more. Let's see here. It's a good one here.
I'm looking at my dog here who's fast asleep, so hopefully the audience is not in the same situation as my dog Luna, who looks very comfortable.
Yeah, you put my dog out too. How about this one? How would you determine the best way to test spices? So just a general one, or should we rely on the lab to tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on your position in the hierarchy of spices, I guess, or the spice world. The major producers, they've been doing this forever. They know, they're on this call, I'm sure. They know what they're doing. They know as much as the testing labs almost or more than how their products behave under various conditions for various test scenarios. As a smaller guy, yeah, I think you need to rely on your laboratory, because the amount of information that's available, the knowledge that's required to do this the right way is high. And it's just probably not worth your time to learn all that stuff. So you've got to have, again, work with a reputable testing lab that knows how to make those decisions for you and will make the right decisions and make sure you're doing the right thing.
All right, we'll just take one more here then. Are there any applications for using spices in product development, such as like in place of artificial food preservatives, considering all their antimicrobial properties?
You're asking the wrong person. There's plenty of people on this call, I'm sure, who could answer that question very much more thoroughly than I can. However, I would suggest that it seems like a great idea. But again, if you look at that slide I showed with the plate counts, right? They are antimicrobial, yes, but only against specific groups of organisms that may or may not be relevant for a given application. Let's put it that way. So it sounds like a great idea, and you see poster after poster, paper after paper with the use of antimicrobials, natural antimicrobials for this, that, and the other. And that's fine. I'm not saying they don't work. They do work. But it's going to be very targeted, and it's going to take a lot of work to show that it's actually knocking down the organisms that are actually going to help you in some way.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, let's go ahead and we'll wrap up our Q&A then. I just want to remind everyone, if we didn't get to your question, we'll certainly get to it, follow up with you afterwards. And again, the recording of the webinar along with a copy of the slides will be available within 3 business days. We'll send that out to everyone registered. So Dan, just thanks again.
Luna finally woke up. My dog is finally awake now too, so apparently I just had to stop talking. Bye, everybody. Thanks. Thank you so much for joining, everybody. I really do appreciate it. I really appreciate the time and the interest.
Yep. Thanks again, everyone. See you next time.
Yeah, take care. Bye.
Bye.